The Real History of Christmas, a Story of Hope and Faith. In the winter of 1943, during the darkest days of World War II, the young American soldier named Thomas Bennett found himself far from home, stationed in a small English village called Ashwood. The war had taken everything from him, his sense of security, his youth, and most painfully, his faith in humanity. Thomas was just 22 years old, but his eyes carried the weight of someone much older. He had seen too much destruction, too much suffering. As December approached, the other soldiers began talking about Christmas, but Thomas felt nothing. How could anyone celebrate when the world was tearing itself apart? One cold evening, while walking through the village, Thomas noticed an elderly woman struggling to carry firewood to a small cottage. Despite his own heavy heart, something moved him to help. The woman, Mrs. Eleanor Crawford, thanked him with a warm smile that seemed to light up the gray winter evening. "You're an American, aren't you?" she asked, inviting him inside for tea. "You must be missing home terribly this time of year." Thomas nodded, sitting by her modest fireplace. "To be honest, ma'am, I don't even know what we're celebrating anymore. Christmas seems like just another day in a world gone mad." Mrs. Crawford smiled gently and poured the tea. "Let me tell you a story, young man. A story about the real history of Christmas. Not the one you see in shop windows or on greeting cards, but the one that has sustained people through the darkest times in human history." Thomas settled into his chair, and the old woman began. 2,000 years ago, the world was also in turmoil. The Roman Empire ruled with an iron fist. People were taxed to the point of poverty, families were separated, and hope seemed like a luxury only the wealthy could afford. Into this darkness a child was born, not in a palace or a hospital, but in a stable, surrounded by animals, with only hay for a bed. His parents, Mary and Joseph, were refugees, forced to travel while Mary was 9 months pregnant because of a census decree. They had no money for a proper room, they had no political power, they had nothing that the world considered valuable. And yet on that night, something extraordinary happened, something that would change the course of human history. But here's what most people don't understand about Christmas, Thomas. It wasn't about the gifts or the decorations or the feast. It was about hope arriving in the most unexpected way, in the most unexpected place, during the most desperate time. Mrs. Crawford set down her teacup, her eyes distant with memory. You see, the first people to hear about this birth were shepherds, the lowest class of society. They worked night shifts in the fields, they smelled like sheep, and polite society avoided them. But they were the first ones invited to witness this miracle. Why? Because Christmas wasn't meant for the powerful or the perfect. It was meant for the broken, the struggling, the ones who had lost hope. Thomas found himself leaning forward, drawn into the story despite himself. As this child grew, Mrs. Crawford continued, he didn't become what anyone expected. He didn't raise an army. He didn't seek political power. Instead, he spent his time with the outcasts, the sick, the poor, the rejected. He taught that love was stronger than hate, that forgiveness was more powerful than revenge, and that every single person, no matter how broken or lost, had infinite worth. And when the powerful felt threatened by this message of hope and equality, they killed him. They executed him in the most brutal way possible, crucifying him like a common criminal. It seemed like the end of everything. His followers were devastated. They had believed he would save them, and now he was dead. But here's where the real power of the Christmas story reveals itself, Thomas. 3 days after his death, something happened that no one expected. He came back to life, and that resurrection transformed everything. It proved that darkness doesn't get the final word, that death doesn't win, that hope is not naive. It's the most powerful force in the universe. Mrs. Crawford set down her teacup and looked directly at Thomas. For 2,000 years, People have celebrated Christmas not because life is easy or the world is perfect, but precisely because it's not. We celebrate because no matter how dark things get, light still breaks through. We celebrate because love still wins, even when it looks like hate is triumphant. We celebrate because hope is not just wishful thinking, it's the truth about how the universe works. Thomas felt something stirring in his chest, something he thought the war had killed. "But how do you keep believing that?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Because I've lived through it," Mrs. Crawford replied softly. "I lost my husband in the First World War. I lost my son in the early days of this one. I've watched this village suffer through bombings and rationing and fear. But every Christmas, even in the darkest years, something miraculous happens. People share what little they have. Strangers become friends. Enemies remember their humanity. Light doesn't disappear, Thomas. It just needs people willing to carry it." She stood up and walked to a small wooden box on her mantel. Opening it, she pulled out a simple ornament, a star made of twisted wire and scraps of cloth. "My son made this before he left for war. It's not beautiful by the world's standards, but to me it represents everything Christmas means. It's made from broken things, transformed into something that points towards light." Thomas held the humble ornament in his calloused hands, and for the first time in months, tears came to his eyes. "I don't know if I can believe like you do," he whispered. "You don't have to believe perfectly," Mrs. Crawford said gently. "You just have to be willing to hope. And hope starts with small acts, helping an old woman carry firewood, showing kindness to a fellow soldier, choosing to see the humanity in your enemy. These aren't small things, Thomas. They're everything." Over the following weeks, something changed in Thomas. He started noticing the small acts of goodness around him. Soldiers sharing cigarettes, villagers dividing meager rations, children laughing despite the war. He began to understand that Christmas wasn't about escaping the darkness, but about bringing light into it. On Christmas Eve, Thomas organized something special. He gathered the soldiers and villagers together in the small church. They had almost nothing, no fancy decorations, barely enough food for a modest meal, no gifts to exchange. But Thomas had learned that Christmas didn't require those things. He stood before the gathered crowd and shared Mrs. Crawford's story. He talked about the real history of Christmas, about hope born in darkness, about love that conquered death, about light that refused to be extinguished. He talked about how the message of that night 2,000 years ago wasn't meant for the comfortable and secure, but for people exactly like them, scared, suffering, far from home. "We're not celebrating because everything is perfect," Thomas said, his voice steady and strong. "We're celebrating because even when everything falls apart, hope remains. We're celebrating because love is stronger than fear and light is more powerful than darkness. We're celebrating because we refuse to let the worst moments of human history define us. Instead, we'll let the best of human nature, our capacity for compassion, sacrifice, and faith, guide us forward." As Thomas spoke, something remarkable happened. The fear and despair that had gripped the room began to lift. People who had been strangers reached out to hold hands. Tears flowed freely, not tears of sadness, but of release, of connection, of renewed hope. In that small church, with almost nothing but each other, they experienced the true spirit of Christmas. Mrs. Crawford sat in the front pew, her eyes shining. She had given Thomas a gift more valuable than gold. She had given him back his faith in the human story, his belief that goodness would ultimately prevail. When the war finally ended, Thomas returned home to America. He carried with him that wire and cloth star, a gift from Mrs. Crawford before she passed away peacefully in her sleep the following spring. For the rest of his life, Thomas told her story. He told it to his children, his grandchildren, and anyone who would listen. He became a teacher, and every December he would share the real history of Christmas with his students. Not a sanitized, commercialized version, but the raw, powerful truth that Christmas celebrates the moment when hope entered a hopeless world, when light broke into darkness, when love proved stronger than death. Christmas, he would tell his students, is not about pretending everything is fine. It's about having the courage to hope even when things aren't fine. It's about being the light in someone else's darkness. It's about believing that no matter how broken the world becomes, love can heal it. And that belief, that stubborn, defiant hope, that's what has kept humanity going for 2,000 years. Thomas Bennett lived